Somewhere in a Chinese textbook, a question rarely gets asked. Most people today assume that homosexuality is a modern idea, something that entered China only recently, borrowed from the West, a concept with no roots of its own in Chinese soil. But more than 2,000 years ago, long before the word homosexuality existed anywhere in the world, Chinese court historians were already writing down stories of deep affection between men. Not hidden, not whispered, written into the official records of emperors and kings. These stories survived for over 2 millennia. They gave the Chinese language two of its most enduring expressions of love between men: the shared peach and the passion of the cut sleeve. So tonight we ask a simple question. What did ancient China actually think about love between men? And how much of what we assume today turns out to be wrong? Before we meet our first emperor, we need to leave a few modern assumptions at the door. Ancient China had no word for homosexuality, no concept of sexual identity the way we understand it today, no sense that loving a man made you a certain kind of person. Desire wasn't sorted into fixed categories. A ruler could take a wife, father children to secure his bloodline, and still openly love a male companion, and none of this was considered a contradiction. What mattered in ancient Chinese court life wasn't who you loved. It was your rank, your usefulness, and above all, your favor with the person in power. That distinction matters because the stories you're about to hear were never written as declarations of sexual identity. They were written as stories about favor, how it is won, how it is enjoyed, and how quickly it can vanish. And the very first of these stories begins not in a palace, but in an orchard.
The year is somewhere in the 6th century BCE. The state is Wei, one of many rival kingdoms of China's spring and autumn period. Its ruler is Duke Ling. At his side is a young courtier named Mi Sha, a man the Duke has grown to adore. We know two stories about him, both preserved in a philosophical text called the Han Feizi, written some 2 centuries later. In the first, Mi Sha receives urgent news. His mother has fallen gravely ill. Without permission, he takes the Duke's own carriage to rush to her side. A crime, under the laws of Wei, punishable by the amputation of a foot. When the Duke learns what happened, he doesn't punish him. He praises him for loving his mother so much that he risked everything to reach her. In the second story, the two men are walking together through an orchard. Mi Sha bites into a peach. It's extraordinary, the sweetest fruit he has ever tasted. Without hesitation, he offers the other half to the Duke. The Duke is
400 years later, in the twilight of the Western Han Dynasty, another story would eclipse even the peach and give the Chinese language its most famous expression for love between men. Its central figure is Emperor Ai, who took the throne at just 20 years old in 7 BCE. At his court served a young official named Dong Xian. According to the Book of Han, the official history of the dynasty, the emperor noticed him one day across the hall, struck, historians tell us, by his elegance and quiet grace. He called him over. They began to talk, and from that conversation, an extraordinary favor began. Dong Xian rose through the ranks with astonishing speed. He and the emperor rode in the same carriage. They dined together, slept in the same chambers, and were, in the words of the old chronicles, as inseparable as a married couple. The emperor, who had a wife of his own, showed little interest in the women of his palace. His devotion belonged almost entirely to Dong Xian. And then came the afternoon that history would never forget. The two men had fallen asleep together after a meal, resting side by side. When the emperor woke, he needed to rise. But Dong Xian was still deep in sleep, his head resting on the emperor's sleeve. He could have simply pulled his arm free. Instead, the emperor of China took a blade and cut off his own sleeve, rather than disturb the man beside him. It's a small gesture,
And that's exactly why it endured. Out of all the grand ceremonies and political triumphs that might have defined Emperor Ai's reign, it was this quiet, private act of tenderness that Chinese writers chose to preserve, and that gave the language a phrase still used today, Duan Xiu, the cut sleeve, a name for love between men that has outlived the dynasty itself by 2,000 years. But history, as always, is more complicated than the legend. Emperor Ai's favoritism came at a cost. Dong Xian was elevated to commander of the armed forces, a staggering promotion for a man with no military record, and resentment simmered at court. When the emperor died suddenly at just 24, without an heir, he had named Dong Xian his successor. The court refused to accept it. Within a day, Dong Xian and his wife were dead by suicide, and his family's fortune was seized. The romance had been real, by every account historians can find, but so was the political storm it left behind. Ancient China did not judge Emperor Ai for loving a man. It judged him for loving too much, too visibly, at the expense of the empire.
The shared peach, the cut sleeve. Two stories separated by 4 centuries, both preserved not in folk tales or forbidden manuscripts, but in official, respected works of Chinese history and philosophy. Court historians didn't erase these stories. They didn't hide them in the margins. They wrote them down, plainly, as part of the record. Because in their world, a ruler loving a man wasn't a scandal worth concealing. It was simply a fact of court life, alongside wives, heirs, and politics. Which brings us back to our question. If these stories could be told so openly, so long ago, what happened between now and now? When did China's attitude begin to change? That shift didn't happen all at once. It would take centuries, and one particular dynasty would set it in motion in ways that are still felt today. In the next episode, we travel forward in time to the Song Dynasty, where China's relationship with love, morality, and power was about to be rewritten.